I mean, my work has always been sociological in nature and at the same time really intimate with the subjects and kind of a function of intimate access or a relationship with the subjects. And I'm always interested in what individuals or actions or kind of groups of people, whatever is in the picture, what that says about our culture. So a lot of times it's in my photography, it's not necessarily the ultimate portrait of that person, it's more that person in a moment that reveals our culture or our cultural values. And so I think that's kind of where I come from. So I'm always both at the same time, like interacting with you as an individual and then also kind of thinking on it in a bigger picture about what does that mean for our society. And it's not a conflict for me because my work, although sometimes comments on society and sometimes is a critical approach, is not in general critical of the person or the subject, but more critical of the kind of cultural context. And so in a way, I want subjects or characters who you can relate to and empathize with, but then also see that predicament that comes from the culture. I did photography. I actually studied film in college as well, but I kind of failed as a filmmaker. I couldn't get grants for any films. I got rejected from many different film schools. And my husband always said, do your photography, that's where your talent is, and through that you'll get to do anything. And in 2004, on the back of this book I did called Girl Culture, HBO gave me the opportunity to direct my first film. So my photography has always been about storytelling, and often storytelling both in a single image and also in a sequence of images, and how that builds in a sequence with text, captions, and first-person interviews. And I've always done first-person interviews, even when I was in college. So I was always interested in the narrative, but film was an opportunity to really take the narrative to a deeper level and also to bring the voice of the subjects into a more immediate and direct kind of forum. So I was interested in that, but that was also the biggest challenge to me. And I think with The Queen of Versailles, it's the first film I've done that brings kind of the aesthetic quality of my photography to film and also the sociological perspective to the film. And in a way is the first narrative that I've built too. Thin, which was a film I did about eating disorders, had a narrative, but it was something that evolved very organically while I was there, and I feel like my editor kind of pulled it out and it was obvious and there it was. This one was just a much more difficult edit. It was more difficult to figure out the narrative, figure out how to tell the story, and so it was a more conscious process on my part. I actually did a paper edit and really kind of built it in a different way. Thin was a completely cinema verite film, and in Queen of Versailles there was a lot of really strong verite footage, but it was hard to understand without the context of the interview thread, because things are really not going very well, for example, for the Seagulls, and they're under tons of financial strain, and they're trying to cut back, and then Jackie goes to Walmart at Christmas and buys a ton of stuff. So like the verite was often confusing, and in a way it needed the spine, the interview spine, to tell the story. And same with David, especially, his most revealing moments came in the interviews, not the verite. And so it just took me a while to figure out how to kind of build that story and take out the repetition. And there are a lot of photographs. I did a photo essay about the Seagulls also, and a lot of the photos play in the film. And then there's also a lot of photographs of Jackie when she was little, and family members and places that are important. So the photography does play an important role. And then the other thing that plays an important role is their representation of themselves. That Jackie and David, one of the things that appealed to me about their environment is it's covered with portraits of themselves, both photographic and paintings, in a way that is almost like royalty, like harks back to commissioning artists to do portraits of yourself. And so there's a huge painting of David in the living room, and Jackie was a beauty queen, and there are pictures of her beauty queen background all over the house, and they're framed in these kind of beautiful gilded frames that are everywhere, and every time I went to the house they would be in a different place. And by the end I realized that this hallway and this way that they represent themselves was really important to the film, and so I got a dolly, and actually dolly tracked down the hallway, and that's part of the opening, and you kind of go between their representations of themselves and their, in the beginning, kind of the fantasy life they lead on a boat, on a private jet. I was really interested in the way pictures function in their world, and especially because they're in control of those images, and like they would always do this Christmas card. And that was one of the things that got me interested in them in the first place, is Jackie showed me this Christmas card of her 6 children, her 7 children, on the plane of on the stairs of their private jet. And the Christmas card, I'm just always interested in that, the way people kind of present themselves to their friends. And so that was an important part of it. And what I did, what actually came out of the Sundance Lab, and the person who helped me with this was Joe Beanie, who has cut many of Werner Herzog films, and we were working on what should the beginning of the film be. And the beginning of the film needs to kind of have a sense of foreshadowing and maybe a mystery that you don't find out till later. And what we ended up finding was a outtake from the first interview where I'm photographing David and Jackie, and my DP is rolling on it. I didn't even remember that existed. And you see Jackie posing for the camera, and then you see what's behind the pose. And for me, it spoke to the question of representation, and also when is she posing, when is she real? And there's an arc in the film where in the beginning, she's hair and makeup are beautiful and clothing is styled, and by the end, I'm filming her getting Botox and lasered, and layers of skin are coming off her face, and in the last scene, she has no makeup on, and she's barefoot, and she's just completely present and herself in front of the camera. And the other thing that the opening sequence speaks to is my relationship with them. I started out photographing Jackie, and Jackie's a model, and she poses, and so it spoke to both Jackie's relationship to the camera, my relationship to them, and then was kind of something that could unfold in the movie. I often think of Jean Renoir's comment about every film is the same film, and I find that I keep coming back to the same ideas. My husband has a photo agency called Institute for documentary photographers, and a lot of us work on long-term projects, and he describes it as all the artists have an itch they can't stop scratching. So I find that I do often come back to these themes, and you're bringing that to my attention for the first time, but I think that there was something about the house, and I think that's part of why Jackie and David agreed to be in the film, which is like showing what you have, being proud of your accomplishments, and then what was amazing about them is that they didn't hide when things did not go as planned, and that's something that, as a filmmaker, I was very, very grateful, and kind of where the story took life. The other thing somebody said to me yesterday was that all my films are about addiction. And I think that there is an element of truth to that Thin is about eating disorders, but you really could put in any kind of addiction, alcoholism or drug. And I think with Queen of Versailles, you can see how consumerism can become an addiction, and how in the let's make bigger and bigger, there's never big enough. And I love Jackie's story about we weren't planning on building the biggest house in America, but then we put in the bowling alley, and we put in the ice skating rink, and we put in the pools, and we put in the kitchens, and it just kind of happened. And there's a scene, again, the Walmart scene, where you can see that madness in a way, the addiction to buying stuff, and buying multiples of certain things. And with David, you can see the addiction to work, which is an addiction that I also share. So yeah, I think there are these themes that the weird thing about the Queen of Versailles is that it brings together all the themes I've ever worked on. Even just David and Jackie's relationship. She's the beauty queen, he's the billionaire, she's 30 years younger. She, as a 40-something woman, has to deal with much of her value kind of coming from her beauty, and then dealing with that aging. And so in a way, it just wrapped, it brought, I think that's why the story was so compelling to me. It's just, it touched on so many issues and themes and ideas that I've worked on in my photography and film work over the last 20 years. Well, it's not so much the first shot for me, it's about the first sequence. And I think that the editor on Thin was Kate Amend, and she's amazing, and she really built the whole first sequence of Thin without me having any input in it. I saw it, and it was amazing, and we never changed it. But what I learned from that, and ironically or luckily, she was also an advisor at the Sundance Lab, and when I went to the Sundance Lab with a rough cut, I didn't have an opening for the film. And we talked about the importance of that opening to kind of, in a way, the opening kind of sums up what the film is. My friend Caroline Labresco, who's a programmer at the Sundance Festival, and she's actually here at Hot Docs, always says that the opening teaches you how to watch the movie. And I guess that's the thing that I was looking for. And so the opening in Queen of Versailles is totally different from the opening of Thin, but it is that sequence that brings you in. You might not fully understand what it all means until you get to the end, but it's all right there. I love the cinema verite tradition, Fred Weissman and D.A. Pennebaker, and I also like more experimental film like Chris Marker, Sunless Sans Soleil, and back to the verite category, The Maisels and Grey Gardens. I like films that are like the photography I like, the decisive moment, life unfolding before the camera. I'm less interested in films that are research papers or kind of written, writer-driven, I guess. So I think that those are my influences. When I went to Harvard, and so the teachers there were Ross McElwee, who did Sherman's March, Rob Moss, who did The River, Same River Twice. And so that was a more personal documentary, which I really like. I like to watch it. It's not my format in that I never want the films to be about me. I always want them to be about the subject. Of course, the subjects that I focus on are always telling stories that I identify with too, and often very personally, and I think that's where the kind of passion lies, or that's where the rubber meets the road. But on the surface, they're not about me. This was the first film where I included myself at all, in the sense that you can see me taking pictures in the beginning, and then you can occasionally hear my voice in the interview. But that was as far as I was going to go. You know, it's very similar in The Queen of Versailles as Kids and Money, where in photography we have what we call the environmental portrait. Arnold Newman kind of came up with that idea, or was the first person to kind of show pictures that were in that vein. And in the environmental portrait, the background and the composition tells as much about the person as the physical person. And I try to use that in my filmmaking too. I think Kids and Money is the perfect example, and Queen of Versailles is also like that. With the main characters, they're 5 interviews each. They're all in different spaces, and the composition behind them tells a story about them and also what's going on in their life at that moment. So the composition is really important to me, and you're exactly right that the interviews are the only place that I am consciously shaping that composition. In the verite, I have a lot of trust in my DP. I'm not behind the camera myself, and I'm not staging anything. I'm just recording life as it happens. But in the interviews, I'm saying, sit in this chair, and this is going to be the background, and I'm going to light it this way. There are also places where the subject can be responsible for their presentation. You know, in the verite, they have to just kind of trust. But in the interviews, they're also presenting the way they want to be presented. And so that's important information too. The thing that drives my sound people crazy though, is I always leave tons of headroom, because that's how my photographs are, and I want all the stuff behind to tell a story about that person. So that drives my sound guys crazy, because they always want to be like this, so the sound can be right there. So I know it's a balance, in filmmaking. Sound is very important, but so is that information. that was really a big part of kind of creating Kids and Money, was the two people kind of bouncing off of each other, and I did that with 2 cameras. And to be able to both interview them both, but also have them reacting to each other in different ways. And that, there were a few times when just magical things happened, like when Phoebe is telling the story about her prom and how much money they spent and how crazy it was. And, you know, she's kind of critical, but she also did it all. And then her friend starts talking and reveals in her interview that everybody came to her house for the pre-prom, but she didn't go to the prom because she didn't have the money to go. And the camera's on Phoebe's face as she's learning this information, and so you see it in real time, and I think that is the kind of life unfolding that is really, as a documentary filmmaker, you live for. And I tried in Queen of Versailles to use let the interviews be verite also. And so to have those moments, rather than your typical interview where people are saying, you know, what they've thought of before, and they're saying, there's no surprises, because they're just kind of saying things. So an influence for me in Kids and Money was Jim Goldberg, the photographer Jim Goldberg, who did a book called Rich and Poor. And he often had 2 characters in it, and they each wrote their perception of the scene underneath the picture. And so that was huge in Kids and Money. With Queen of Versailles, I thought about doing that, but it just never really worked. In a way, the thing about David and Jackie is they live in their own worlds, and they don't really know what's going on in each other's world. So it didn't really make sense to have them together. So I don't think I ever had a 2-person interview, but what I did have was things going on around the edges and allowing kind of this relationship to come out. Like at the end, when David's really stressed about everything that's going on, he starts saying to me, "Are we done yet? Because this could go on forever." And you see my PA come in and wipe the sweat off of his face with a blotter. So I let in kind of life around the edges. With Queen of Versailles, I always saw the characters in this house as a microcosm of society. So I always knew that there would be David and Jackie, the parents, and then kids, and I didn't know how many, and then the domestic staff, and that they were all kind of important. And then what happened as the story started to develop, is it became clear at a certain point that it was really David and Jackie's story. That it was really this love story, and kind of Jackie being the heart of the story, and David, in a way, being her foil, and that they were really the story. But it was always, I fought for the minor characters because they were the ones that you needed to understand that Jackie's story was a mirror of what was going on kind of at all levels of American society and in all different ways. And so in a way with Queen of Versailles, you kind of have this focus on Jackie and David, and then the other characters kind of mirroring and reflecting and acting as foils for them in a lot of different ways. There's Jonquil, who is the daughter that came from poverty and is now living in the mansion, and she came from Binghamton, which is where Jackie's from. So she was kind of like a miniature Jackie, and you could see the transition that Jackie made in her life, but hers in a much shorter time span. There was her daughter, Victoria, the eldest daughter, who kind of comes into her own in the film and also mirrors other qualities of Jackie's kind of strength and her kind of quality as a survivor. And then there was Cliff, who was the limo driver, who bought like 15 homes and lost them all. And so in a way, he had a foreclosure story that was also like David's, but his story was more representative of what went on for most people in America. So I kind of had more characters than the film could sustain, and there were a couple that had to kind of get a little bit de-emphasized because it was just too much. There was Wendy, the housekeeper, who had an amazing story, and in the end, she's in the film as the housekeeper, but there wasn't room to go into her story. But Richard, the son of David, became a character who became really important, and then there was this kind of Shakespearean element between him and his father, and so he became more important. So In the end, there are a lot of characters, but they all kind of center around David and Jackie. Within, and I would say it was, with Queen of Versailles, it was a more challenging structure, but I felt good about where we ended up. Within, my editor, Kate Amend, had a lot to do with it. I guess in the field, we did decide that we were going to focus on 4 characters. There were a couple others we tried. They didn't really work out. And then the 4 characters had all this interaction, and the story just kind of unfolded. So the central story was really Polly and Shelley's friendship, and Elisa and the betrayal that went on. And Brittany was kind of a side story, but in a way was the heart and the emotion of the story, or Brittany and Shelley. And Brittany's story as this adolescent story was just really powerful. And in some ways, the Thin is kind of, it's about these 4 women, but it's really about what so many women go through. And like the opening sequence that you talked about, or the opening sequence, has lots of women in it and not even our main characters, which is kind of a risky choice, but it just shows the repetition, I think, of this experience. And when I went back to the clinic another time, when I was doing my photography, they said, oh, well, this is the Brittany, and this is the Shelley, and this is the Polly, that there were these kind of, what do you call it, like characters in a way, and people, those traits repeat in the population. It's funny because my first photography teacher, Barbara Norfleet, came to the screening the night before last at the Boston Film Festival, and she said Versailles is like a character, and I love the shots of Versailles. And I think the house and the idea of house was just a really powerful theme in the movie, and so there are a lot, in a way, both houses, the old house and the new house, become characters in the film, and both the ephemera around the house and the architecture and the things that Jackie and David keep is really important. There's a scene where we go into their warehouse where they've been collecting the furniture for the last 10 years to put in the palace when it's done. And it's like straight out of Citizen Kane, just like this huge warehouse of antiques that mix up classic French antiques with pure kitsch. And so the spaces and the still lifes were a very important element of the filmmaking.